Huh.
Watching Kyle's unboxing videos again?
Yeah, he always finds the coolest... No way! A robot dog? Gotta ask where he got it.
Or use your Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra. Just draw a circle around the dog on your screen, and it shows you where to buy it right in the app.
Whoa, I just learned a new trick. And that for once, I beat Kyle to the next big thing.
Circle it, find it with the new Galaxy S24 Ultra and circle the search with Google. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Internet connection required. Results may vary based on visuals.
Hello, Duke fans, and welcome to episode 363. It is a palindrome of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. It is Monday, November 29th, 2021. I believe this will be our last podcast for the month of November, but you never know. Things sometimes move quickly around here. We have a few things to talk about. The main thing we have to do is preview the Ohio State Duke basketball game, which is coming up tomorrow night. That's Tuesday night. We also have to talk about the AP poll that just came out, where, surprise, Duke is back to number one. And in unfortunate, it's unfortunate news, melancholy news for Duke fans, not specific to basketball, but Duke and former now football head coach David Cutcliffe have decided to part ways. So we'll spend a few minutes on that at the end. But before we get to all of that, of course, we have to introduce ourselves, as we often do. Say hello. I am your host for this episode. I am Sam Klein. I am coming to you from back home in Boston, where I have returned post-Thanksgiving holiday. Jason Evans and Donald Wine are also here. Jason, I will start with you. How are you, sir?
Doing pretty good. Blue Devils back where they belong at number one. When we get to that part of the story, I got some interesting stats about how remarkably common it is that Duke should be considered the best team in college basketball.
And very interesting, because Duke is not even close to being number one in the efficiency ratings, but the results so far this year say that if it's not Duke, that there aren't that many teams that have resumes that are clearly better than the Blue Devils. Again, we'll talk about it. Donald Wine it looks like he's back home from his travels. So Donald, I am impressed that you survived so long in Las Vegas. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I just landed back in DC literally about an hour and a half before we record. So it was a red eye home. It was a very, very long flight with another long flight, but we back. And as Jason said, order for now has been restored.
And I'll say, Donald, that looking at you, you don't look terrible. And given the amount of time that you spent in Vegas, I feel like that's a win.
It's always a win. See, I also sleep well on planes. When you fly as much as I do, you have to learn how to sleep on planes. I saw 0 minutes. I saw maybe 5 minutes of the first flight and 0 minutes of the second flight. The Back of My Eyelids is the greatest movie you will ever watch on a plane, and I watched it twice.
Love it. Love it. All right. So as I said, we have to preview the Ohio State game. We have to spend a few minutes on the ACC Big Ten Challenge. We have lots of topics to get to. The first thing we're going to do is preview the game. And as we said, the last time we previewed a game, when we got to talk to an expert about Gonzaga basketball, this time we are doing the same thing again. So we had the opportunity to chat with a gentleman from Land Grant Holy Land, which is the Ohio State SB Nation blog. You could say that there are our cousin over on the SB Nation network. Jason was able to have a conversation yesterday with Connor Lamons. So I won't bore you too much about my knowledge about Ohio State basketball, because it's not as good as Connor's is. So why don't we listen to that interview right now?
We are joined now by Connor Lamons. He's a writer at Land Grant Holy Land, which is the Ohio State site for SB Nation. He's also the host of the Ohio State basketball podcast that they have there called Bucketheads. Connor, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, so the idea behind this is we want you to give us a deep dive on the Ohio State basketball team ahead of Duke's matchup with them in the next couple days. First thing I noticed, by the way, when looking at Ohio State, is that you guys have done a pretty good job of beating the bad teams. You had a game against Akron that was only a 1-point win. That was kind of nervous, but You beat the bad teams, and you got a nice win over Seton Hall. But Xavier in Florida fell to both those guys. I mean, those are good clubs, but summarize the season for me so far for Ohio State. Are you guys meeting expectations or not?
It's been concerning. I think part of it is on injuries so far. You don't want to be banged up this early in the season, but their second best player, I would say, Justice Suing, he is out for indefinitely. It sounds like it could be January, it could be February. Can't rule out the whole season. Justice Suing is out. He is a very crucial piece for them, especially on defense. And then Eugene Brown is also out potentially for the Duke game. He missed that whole Fort Myers tip-off. And then Seth Towns is also out with having back surgery until December. So they're already very banged up. They've struggled, even, Akron, Niagara, they struggled against inferior opponents. They played up to Xavier, Seton Hall, Florida. I think this is a good basketball team. I think this is a tournament team, but I think the expectations for this team have kind of shifted from a Big Ten title contender when it started out to, I don't know, somewhere between like a 7 and a 10 seed in the tournament. I still think they're a tournament team, though. I think they're a good team that nobody should take for granted.
Right. And of course, the game is at Ohio State. And anytime you're playing at home, you get a big advantage there. Hey, I want to talk to you about your best player. 6'7" power forward, EJ Liddell. I checked the Ken Palm Player of the Year standings. He's the leader. Ken Palm considers him the best player in the nation right now, ahead of Drew Timme and Keegan Murray of Iowa. 22.5 points per game. I mean, dude's blocking almost 4 shots per game. He's even hitting his threes. He doesn't take a lot of them, but he's hitting 40% of his threes. Talk to me about what kind of a surprise this season's, because he was good, but he wasn't this good in the past.
Yeah, he was very good as a freshman. He came off the bench as a freshman. He was very good last season as well. But if you watched very much Ohio State basketball, you know who Dwayne Washington Jr. was. He was their leading scorer last season, and EJ Liddell was kind of Robin to Batman. But they were both very good last year. Dwayne plays for the Indiana Pacers now, kind of bouncing between their G League team and the Pacers. So EJ now is able to step forward and kind of be like the go-to guy now. And you're right about the threes. He's expanded his game. That's part of the thing that when he did the NBA draft process, they talked about was, when you're only 6'8", that kind of thing, you're not going to be big enough to bang down low with NBA centers. He needs to expand his range a little bit. And he's been there. Him and Justin Arns are the best 3-point shooters in the team. And that's huge for him because he's a big, thick guy. He's every bit of, 6'7", 230, 240. He'll bring your center out to the elbow, to the kind of the free throw line area, and even bring it out to the 3-point line. So he's extending teams and making their bigger guys, move outside.
And now is he, I got the impression he was mostly playing like power forward. So we would see him matched up against 6'10", 250 Paulo Banchero, player of the year contender. Are they playing him a little bit at center now to try and draw big men away?
They're playing him more at center than they had hoped, just because of some of the guys that they've lost already, missing some of the personnel. They were hoping to play EJ specifically at the 4 this season, not have to play him at the 5. But when you're missing a couple guys who have some height, he has gone down to center. He's moved to the center spot a few times, but they would like to play him at the power forward spot, have Kyle Young and Zed Key and some Joey Brunk at the 5. But yes, I think that Paulo Banchero is going to be the matchup with Liddell.
Now you mentioned, Key and Young, sort of the backup centers or starting centers for that matter. Those guys are each 6'8". EJ's 6'7", 6'8". Y'all don't really have anybody much. You got Joey Brunk, who's a little bit bigger than that, but doesn't play a ton, I guess. Duke's a big team. Is that a concern for you in this matchup?
Yeah, very much so. I think this is one of the worst possible matchups for Ohio State to get in the ACC challenge. They struggled with Xavier because of their length, and Duke is a taller team than Xavier. They didn't struggle as much with Florida as I thought. Colin Castleton's a big guy, but they didn't struggle as much with Florida as I thought they would, but they really struggle with Xavier with some of their length. And on our last podcast episode, myself and Justin Golba were talking about that, and I think this is one of the worst possible matchups for Ohio State, because if Liddell is on Banchero, then you say, okay, so who's Duke center? Is it Mark Williams is his name, right?
Mark Williams, yeah, who just had a great game against Drew Timme and Chet Holmgren.
Exactly. So if you put Liddell, who's basically your biggest guy, on on Banchero, who's going to be on Williams. And then Keels is going to be a problem too, because not as how tall he is, but man, he's just a big linebacker. He is a big guy. And I don't know if Ohio State has a guard who's strong enough to guard him. So I think there's going to be some mismatches all over the place.
Well, yeah, you've clearly scouted the Duke team, and we appreciate that. Hey, tell me what Ohio State's trying to do on offense. What's working and what isn't?
Last season, so last season they were like a top 5 offense in Ken Pom, and defense is absolutely atrocious. And this year it's kind of come back to level. Defense has been better. Offense hasn't been quite as efficient. The go-to is going to be get the ball to EJ Liddell as much as possible, because he's going to have a mismatch somewhere. If he's going to bring somebody out, this is going to be the first game, I think, where they're going to be tested that just getting the ball to EJ Liddell to make something happen, it might not work. Somebody else is going to have to step up. And that's where missing Justice Suing is such a big thing in this game. I think you're going to have to see somebody like Zed Key really step up in this game down low if EJ Liddell is having trouble with Banchero. But I guess to answer your question in short, it's been get EJ Liddell the ball and make something happen. And he's shooting almost 60% from the floor this season, and it's worked more times than not. But that's not really a sustainable strategy.
So I know your team's really experienced. You got a lot of juniors and seniors who are playing for you, but you've got at least a couple freshmen who are making significant contributions. Talk to me about Johnson and Branham.
Yeah, so Michi Johnson he's a really exciting player. He actually played last season, as he should have been a high school senior last season. He enrolled and got to Ohio State in January and got some minutes in the second half of the season because Ohio State had some injuries at guard and they needed him to come in. So he's a really exciting player. He shows flashes of being really explosive. He can finish with the right. He can finish with the left. If you watch the Seton Hall game, he had a game-winning 3-pointer against Seton Hall. That's how they won that game. And Branham he had a few really good games against Bowling Green, against Akron, against Niagara, but when the competition got tougher, he got in some early foul trouble. You have some experienced guards who are really taking advantage of him, especially driving to the basket on shot fakes. So there are a couple really good guards that are going to get better. They got to get through some growing pains, though. And you said this team is pretty old. If you look at the roster, that's true. However, Michi Johnson and Malachi Branham are getting more minutes than some of those older guards right now. So this is a fun but frustrating team because those younger guards are getting a lot of the minutes we thought the older guys were going to get.
Hey, really quick, I want to touch on the defense. You said it's better than last year. What are they trying to do? Are they playing zone? Are they trapping? Is it man-to-man? School me a little bit on Ohio State's D.
They've done mostly man-to-man, but they've switched to zone when they've struggled. They have a couple guys who are really good on-ball defenders in Jamari Wheeler and Eugene Brown, which Eugene Brown, he may miss this game again with concussion. Eugene Brown comes off the bench. Jamari Wheeler transferred from Penn State last year. Those are two guys that you kind of want to assign to specific guys to lock them down. This game might be difficult. I don't think Jamari Wheeler is going to be a great matchup for Trevor Keels. So I don't know if they will actually go with man-to-man as much this game because of the matchups. But for most of the season, yeah, they've been doing mostly man-to-man. When they've struggled, they've switched over to a zone. Defense has been looking a lot better this season than it was last year.
Hey, I promise not to take too much of your time. So we're going to wrap it up here. You already mentioned you're worried about Duke's size and length. You're worried about the physicality of guys like Trevor Keels. What's your prediction for this game? I mean, it's at Ohio State. I mean, that gives you guys a real advantage. If it was in a neutral site, I think I can probably guess. But what do you think is going to happen in this contest?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if it was a neutral site, I would take Duke clear and easy by a pretty good margin in this one. The shot where Ohio State plays, it's not a great home environment. It's way too big to sell out most nights, but this game is going to be a sellout. There will be close to 19,000 people in there. And I think that'll give Ohio State a little bit of an advantage. But when you get down to it, the talent gap and the mismatches is going to be tough. So I would probably take Duke by, I don't know, somewhere between probably 8 and 10 points, not a blowout because it's at home, but I think it's going to be too much for them to overcome.
Wow. I love the brutal honesty there from an Ohio State podcaster. Thanks a lot, Connor Lamons. We appreciate it. Folks, if you're interested in Ohio State basketball, reach out and find Connor because these guys clearly know what they're talking about. He's with Land Grant Holy Land and the podcast Bucketheads. Connor, again, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a good one.
So thanks again to Connor Lamons for coming on and chatting Ohio State basketball with us. I know it's Donald knows that in particular that it is a tough time at this moment to be an Ohio State fan. So I can see him grinning about the Michigan game from Saturday. But we're not doing football. We're doing basketball here. The Ohio State fans have to move on, even though I know they won't. So Jason, I'll come to you first. Reactions to the conversation with Connor about Ohio State and how much he is. It sounds like he's worried about this matchup with Duke on Tuesday.
Yeah, and I thought so. First of all, you got to praise the guy for being brutally honest. Ohio State was forecasted. I mean, look, the reason they're playing Duke is everyone expected them to be one of the top couple teams in the Big Ten. They were forecasted nationally to be about a top 15 kind of program, not far from where Duke was forecast by the experts in the preseason. And yet Ohio State's season has been, I don't want to call it slumping, but they've been going down in the rankings while Duke's been going up in the rankings. And as a result, you have a game that, even though it's at Ohio State, I think most people think Duke, maybe Ohio State's a tiny, tiny favorite because it's at home, but this is expected to be, you heard from the Ohio State folks that they don't think they're going to win this game. And I was struck by how much he acknowledged injuries have really affected this team. They're perhaps relying on EJ Liddell too much. They're asking him to do everything for them. And he's a fabulous player. The top, as I mentioned, the number one player in Ken Palm's Player of the Year rankings, which is not easy to do. That's a lot of stats. That's a lot of efficiency and stuff like that. But he can't do it by himself. And then the thing that you really heard, I think, was a resignation that they don't have the size. They just don't have the size. We just saw Duke take on the best pair of big men in the country and probably beat them in terms of the matchup up front. For Duke then to turn around and be taking on an Ohio State team that's playing 6'7" and 6'8" guys in the front line, including some of them who are not that bulky and beefy. That's just going to be a huge problem for Ohio State. I don't know how they handle Mark Williams. I don't know how they handle Paulo Banchero. I think I can say that for just about every team on Duke's schedule, but for Ohio State especially, I think it could be a real problem for them.
Donald, what's your read on this game? Do you feel as confident as Jason and I guess as Connor do that Duke is in good position here to beat Ohio State, even though this game is on the road, presumably in a hostile environment?
Yeah, well, first of all, tomorrow's my birthday, so we can't lose at Ohio State on my birthday. That's just the facts. It's written in the script. I already read it. So, tell everybody that this is going to happen. We got to beat Ohio State on the road. But I will say, Jason, the great thing that you talked about with him was that inside, battle that could happen tomorrow, because I've seen a couple of games of Ohio State. I saw the Seton Hall game and I saw the Xavier game, and both times their struggles came on the inside. And it wasn't necessarily that EJ Liddell or anybody was being bad. It was that they are not efficient on the inside. They were just going after shots. They were being very lazy when it comes to their offensive set. And then they would try to go up for a layup or something like that and really just kind of go at it kind of lazy. And because of that, Xavier or Seton Hall was able to get and run it the other way. Now, they were able to get it together against Seton Hall. But when it comes to the inside, they're going to have a lot of times where kind of, if you remember a couple years ago, the old Miami teams, where they would just kind of throw balls at the basket and hope they would get offensive rebounds and hope that you got tired and they try to do 3 or 4, throwing at the baskets in one possession and try and get it in on the 5th one. This is what Ohio State did against Seton Hall. Seton Hall was not able to catch up to that at a certain point. They did tire out. But against Xavier was kind of like, what are you going to do? Like, if you're just going to throw the ball at the basket every single time, we're eventually going to take it and run the other way. And that's what they did. So I think when it comes to Paulo Banchero, when it comes to Mark Williams, and even Theo John, they have a size advantage and they have an efficiency advantage. And I think they need to use that against Ohio State.
Another thing that sort of ties into that I wanted to bring up because a listener, a friend of mine, emailed me earlier and pointed out that one thing we didn't talk about post Gonzaga game is how well Duke did at stopping Gonzaga's transition offense, where Gonzaga, especially against UCLA, was able to leak out and get a lot of buckets. Ohio State's just not going to be able to get away with that sort of thing against Duke. Duke is too big and too skilled in, with those big men to let Ohio State guys sort of get around them like that. And I'm conscious of the challenge that EJ Liddell poses to anybody who he's playing against, because he has been so effective and so efficient this season, but Duke can throw so many bodies at him. Like the number of fouls that Duke can give to EJ Liddell, even if he gets to the line a bunch, Mark Williams can foul him a couple times. Trevor Keels can foul him a couple times. Wendell Moore can foul him a couple times. And there's still sort of, space left over for that sort of thing. So even if Duke is letting Liddell get his, I agree that the sort of prognostication goes this way. And sort of coming back to something that Jason was talking about the ACC Big Ten Challenge, I think that the organizers would have reshuffled the matchups. We can talk about this for a few
Duke
minutes,
and Purdue,
but
they would have made it Duke and Purdue all day.
And what a week it would have been to have the Duke Purdue game with Duke and Purdue
Absolutely.
being like the two teams with the best resumes so far. There are a couple of these games where one team has kind of gone up and one has kind of come down since the beginning of the season, right, Jason?
Oh yeah, for sure. And look, I don't know. Are we transitioning now from Ohio State to the entire challenge?
I think the benefit of having Connor on is that we don't have to spend too much time on this game specifically, right?
Yeah, well, there's one thing I do want to point out for us on offense that I think is going to be important. We got a couple of emails from an avid listener, Regina Lee, who actually was talking about at first not making the game, but she was able to make it to the Gonzaga game. So Regina, hi, I'm glad you made it to Las Vegas for that epic battle. But she asked about the X's and O's of some of the plays that Duke runs. And luckily, I think there was a play that we do quite a bit that I think you may see a lot against Ohio State. And if you realize, we'll have guys come up, either Paulo Banchero, Wendell Moore, Trevor Keels, even Jeremy Roach. They start at the top of the key, and there's usually four guys across the lane. And we kind of do that weave where we, dribble to the corner, hand it off to a guy who tries to come around. And eventually the idea is one of them is going to drive straight to the basket and try to get a layup. The problem is sometimes when Jeremy Roach does that, or even when Trevor Keels did that against Gonzaga, we had a couple of guys that did not shuffle down with them. And what I mean is those guys that are on the wings that hand the ball off, they either need to slash to the basket or they need to go to the corner. And if they go to the corner, there were times that we were able to get great threes. Wendell Moore was great at this against Gonzaga, where he was open because as the defense collapses on the person with the ball in the paint, the obvious lane that's going to be open for a passing window are the two corners. There's also a guy on the wing that can also slash to the basket, which you saw a couple of times with Mark Williams. He would hand the ball off. Wendell Moore would kind of drive around, and he would just drop it off to Mark Williams, who would tomahawk dunk it over somebody, namely Chet Holmgren. That one play where he just absolutely yammed it on him, it's because of this play. So look for that against Ohio State. But the idea is going to be this. If we're going to be able to win, we're going to need to be consistent from three-point land. We don't have to have a great percentage, obviously, but it'd be great to have one. But the way to do it is to have open shots. The way to have open shots is to make sure that whoever catches that ball, they need to look for the wings first, then look for the slasher that's coming in right behind him, because those are going to be the three open passing lanes for Duke in this. And when we talk about this interior battle, they're going to try and focus on that. Ohio State will. They're going to try and focus on stopping Paulo Banchero and Mark Williams and even Theo John. That's going to leave our wings and our guards open. Joey Baker, when he comes to the game, if he parks in the corner, he should have several open chances, or at least open looks, to get 3-pointers. And if he can make a few of those, Ohio State's in big trouble.
So let's then talk about the rest of the ACC Big Ten Challenge. Now that we've previewed Ohio State a little bit, Jason, I'll let you kick this one off. What do you think about the rest of the challenge? Any games that are of note to you that you're going to be paying attention to? And maybe we have to start with Purdue, but go anywhere that you think is interesting here.
So unless you've been hiding under a rock, you're probably aware that that the ACC has had a really, really rough pre-conference season. We're just losing games left and right. And the conference is not very good in any of the advanced metrics. And as we know, in recent years, the NCAA selection committee is using those advanced metrics more and more. And as a result, you got to start to wonder how many NCAA bids the ACC is going to get. So what I'm really looking for is those teams that look like, other than Duke, the teams that look like they are sort of at the top of the ACC, how those teams do against fairly good, important Big Ten competition. So like Virginia Tech is playing Maryland. It's at Maryland, which is unfortunate because I think if it was at Virginia Tech, I'd feel really good about the Hokies winning. But that's a huge game for them. You pick up a win there against a good but not great Maryland team, a Maryland team that has struggled a little more this year maybe than some people thought. That's a big feather in your cap if you're Virginia Tech. Florida State, Purdue. It's at Purdue. That's too high a mountain probably for Florida State to climb. But boy, if they did, it'd be huge for the ACC. Louisville's got Michigan State. Notre Dame's got Illinois. Again, all these games are on the road. One of the things that happened, unfortunately, for the ACC this year is somehow all of our good teams are playing on the road and all of our bad teams are playing at home. But that could be real. It could really skew the challenge because our bad teams are really bad. And I think that most of the teams in the Big Ten are better, especially at the bottom, than the ACC is. So you could see it's entirely possible the ACC wins 2, 3, maybe 4 games in the challenge. It could be really, really brutal. But again, I'm focusing on those games among the teams at the very, very top: Virginia Tech, Florida State, Louisville, Notre Dame, Virginia, Clemson, North Carolina. Almost every one of whom are playing on the road other than North Carolina. They've got Michigan at home, but God, Michigan. Any one of those teams that gets a win, that's an important step for those teams in solidifying a resume for the NCAA tournament. And frankly, the ACC needs some wins so that when we play conference games, it doesn't look bad if you pick up a loss. If you go 15-5 in the ACC, I want that to be impressive, not look like you lost 5 games to teams that suck.
Yeah, to put numbers around that, Jason, the ACC has, it looks like 8 teams who are ranked better than 50th in KenPom as of today. One of them is favored in their game in the ACC Big Ten Challenge. And that's Clemson again, who's playing Rutgers on Tuesday. Otherwise, in fact, even the Ohio State game for Duke, KenPom basically has it as a toss-up, but an Ohio State victory because he has to pick something. His numbers say that it's basically a toss-up between Duke and Ohio State, probably because the game is on the road, and I think that sort of gives favor to whoever the home team is. But
I was gonna say my bet is when the odds makers, when Vegas, when the money starts coming in, Duke will be favored against Ohio State. A, because people like to bet on Duke, but B, because I think from an eye test standpoint, people are like, wait a second, this just doesn't make sense. But it's worth noting there are a bunch of like toss-up games according to KenPom in these. The Duke Ohio State game you mentioned is a toss-up. Virginia Tech Maryland 50-50, that's a toss-up. Pomeroy has the Clemson Rutgers game as a toss-up. He's got Virginia Iowa.
I was going to say even as favored, Clemson's not even overwhelmingly favored against Rutgers. Right.
But there are all these toss-ups, and the ACC needs to come down on the right side of those coin tosses more often than not. Otherwise, this could be a brutally bad challenge. The only ACC teams that are sort of favored in a big way, NC State has Nebraska. Nebraska's really not very good, and they're favored by a lot. And I think that's probably like the only one where you go, oh, the ACC's, it looks like the ACC's almost certainly going to win. Yeah, it's not a good look the rest of the games.
Having said that, from a neutral standpoint, there will be some really good games in this, and just competitive games, because as you said, there are some good teams that are on the road against some decent teams. I think one that's intriguing that a lot of people probably won't talk about, but we should probably watch it because I think it will be intriguing, is Wisconsin, Georgia Tech. Both of them have started out fairly well. I think they're both 5-1. Wisconsin's ranked. Georgia Tech obviously is coming off of that ACC tournament championship that they had last year to basically stream into the dance. And they've used that to their advantage. But also, as you remember, last year, Georgia Tech was impossible to beat at home. So I think that's going to be a very intriguing matchup where a lot of people probably have Wisconsin favored in that matchup. But don't sleep on Georgia Tech in that game, because I think them playing at the Pavilion is going to be something that they can, use that to their advantage. So I'm looking forward to this because I think there's a lot of competitive games for us, though. I think the ACC, as you said, Jason and Sam, that I think we're in an uphill battle, because I think from an ACC standpoint, some of these matchups really were probably based off of last year's success or not success. And they didn't focus on what the teams were going to be like this year. I know that's hard to do with the transfer portal and the draft and everything, but we're looking at a few games where I'm like, the odds makers may think it's close, but I don't think it's going to be as close as it will be. But there are some that will be good.
I'm generally a believer in Florida State. I just think that Leonard Hamilton does a good job with his program, and yeah, they're not favored to beat Purdue. Purdue has been one of the strongest, if not the strongest teams so far this season, and we'll talk about the AP poll in a minute. But that's definitely one to watch on Tuesday. Is sort of the undercard to the Duke Ohio State game, is that Florida State Purdue game. I'm going to try to tune into that one because Leonard Hamilton usually has his teams sort of in good shape early in the season. And by the way, this is one of the last opportunities that ACC teams will have to prove themselves before conference play starts, and that's where the number of bids that the conference gets really get figured out now at this time of year. So it's definitely a big week for the ACC to try to dig out of a little bit of the hole that they've been in here.
Yeah, Sam. And when it comes to these challenges, I mean, you have the SEC, I think, plays the Big 12 or the Pac-12. All these challenges are meant so that at the end of the year, the committee can go, oh, well, this conference is better than that conference. Right now, a lot of people do not like the ACC. I mean, like the early projections right now, of course, they don't really matter. But 4 teams are in Joe Lunardi's bracketology for right now. So we're trying to get 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 teams in. Starting out with 4 is a very, very bad prognosis to do that. So this is where the ACC needs to say, hey, look, this team, this conference that you think is the best conference in America, we can hang with them. And if we can hang with them, then that sets everything up for in-conference games where you go, oh, well, Syracuse beat this team and Georgia Tech beat this team. Those are all good wins. That's what the ACC is looking for in this.
Hey, Sam, you want to transition to our next topic, the AP poll? Guess how many ACC teams are ranked this week? 1.
Is it just 1?
It's just 1. And it's not even like the ACC has teams like really knocking right on the door. I mean, like North Carolina's like 1, 2, 3, 4, like 8th or 9th in, also receiving votes. Virginia Tech and Wake Forest and Louisville are also receiving votes at the very bottom, like 2-3 points. The ACC is other than Duke at the very top, the ACC is absent from the AP top 25. There's your transition to our next topic, man.
I was going to say I need to take a break for us to talk about the poll. So you've given me the preview for it, folks. We're going to take the break. We'll be right back. We'll talk about the fact that Duke is now back to number 1. So as you know by now, Duke is number 1 in the AP poll, and Jason gave us a bit of the background on how poorly the rest of the conference is doing, but he also gave us the preview on some numbers that he's going to be sharing about Duke being number 1 in the AP poll. So Jason, take it away, sir.
Yeah, so here are the numbers for you. 145, that's the first number. It's the 145th time that Duke has been ranked number 1. That, my friends, is an all-time college basketball record. Duke, by the way, got 51 of the 61 first place votes this week. Purdue was the team that got 9 first place votes, and Gonzaga still got another number 1 vote. I really want to meet the guy. I want to understand the person who watched Duke play Gonzaga and still voted Gonzaga number 1.
I argued that I was texting with my brother. I argued that he was the lone person in America who was like, yo, 10:30 on a Friday, on Black Friday, I am going to sleep. You tell me who wins. And then he woke up and saw us close. He goes, well, I'll still vote Gonzaga.
I think it's even worse than that. This voter clearly submitted their ballot on Thursday.
No,
maybe Friday morning.
He's like, hey, I don't work holidays. Here's my ballot.
So as I continue the countdown of the numbers surrounding Duke being number 1, this is now Mike Krzyzewski's 21st different season where he has had a team ranked number one. Can we marinate on that for a moment? That's a crazy number. There are schools out there that have never, really good basketball programs that have never gotten to number one in their entire lifetimes. There are really good basketball programs that hey, we did it 3 times in the past decade. Wow.
Jason, Purdue has never been number one.
Yes. Yes. Really good basketball program. Never been number one. Mike Krzyzewski's done it in 21 different seasons. Coach K has been number one 127 weeks of his career. It's just, it's crazy. And guys,
I don't know if Purdue fans have ever rooted for Ohio State as hard as they're going to root for Ohio State against Duke tomorrow night.
Right.
Because by the way, this is also Duke's, administer whatever superstitious insert you need here, but this is Duke's last really tough non-conference game. Because Duke's non-conference schedule this year was basically Kentucky, Ohio State, Gonzaga, and then a whole bunch of Drek. So this is the last shot that Duke has to lose in the non-conference. So Purdue is very much rooting for Ohio State tomorrow night.
And the last number I wanted to mention, like I said, Coach K has been ranked number one in 21 different seasons. To put that in perspective, the guys who are second, that's obviously the most of all time, are John Wooden and Roy Williams. They've each been ranked number one in 12 seasons. They're both, of course, retired now. John Wooden, obviously, Roy Williams just retired, but they're each at 12 seasons being ranked number one. Coach K's at 21. He's almost doubled the second and third place guys. Combine them together and you almost reach Coach K. So it's a remarkable record of achievement. And it's just cool that Duke in his final season was able to give him yet another number one rated team.
I will say when it comes to the poll, and of course this is an early poll, so while we are excited, we also use to measure it and kind of saying, hey, we're still in December. We want to be number one in April, obviously. But Jason, when we were talking about the ACC Big Ten Challenge and how the nation views the Big Ten versus how they view the ACC, take a look at some of these rankings, because I've seen some of these teams. Some of these teams have not played well at all this year in the Big Ten, but they're still ranked. Whereas, a loss, for some of these teams in the ACC, one loss was enough to bounce them from the rankings. And it's because the Big Ten has the stature of, hey, no matter what, our teams are really good. Yeah, we may slip up in the early season, but it's because we're playing decent teams. Some of these teams that they've lost to are not decent. They may be Power 5 teams, but they're not that good. Michigan, for example, lost to Seton Hall at home and then got the doors blown off of them by Arizona. And Arizona is decent, but they're not a top 25 team by any stretch. And neither is Seton. Seton Hall is probably ranked because of their non-conference schedule and the fact they've plucked a couple of wins. But these teams should not be losing, or they should not be beating the likes of Michigan or Michigan State or Wisconsin. So this is where the ACC really needs to say, hey, look, if you're saying that all these teams who have lost a couple during the regular season so far are still high and mighty, we need to start plucking off some wins bad. And some of these teams, especially when we talk about towards the end of the season, they don't have a lot of opportunities left, as you mentioned, to get some of these big time wins. So this week is going to be a big week for the ACC.
Well, Donald, the only counter I would have to that is Seton Hall and Arizona and some of these other teams that you say, oh, they beat Big Ten teams. The Big Ten also has some pretty good non-conference victories. Aside from Duke, the ACC's got nothing in terms of non-conference victories.
That's fair too.
The ACC's record against top 40 teams in Ken Pom, other than Duke, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 wins, not more than that. Our record against good teams is dismal, which is why we have to pick up some wins this week. Or like you said, Joe Lunardi, he may be right, and the ACC may be looking at 4 bids or something terrible like that, which would just be atrocious.
And if you thought that in a normal year, ACC opponents that Duke faces on the road get excited for Duke to come into town so that they can take them down, this year It's Coach K's last year, and Duke is one of the only good teams in the conference. So teams are going to be desperate for victories against good teams, and Duke is going to be one of the only ones available to them. So it just shows you, like, if you didn't think Duke had the target on their back, so to say, going into conference play, it just emphasizes it here. I was actually just going to add that I'm surprised that Duke was so overwhelmingly getting the first place votes this week. I know that it was about toppling Gonzaga, but I was actually thinking that Duke and Purdue would probably be closer in first place votes. In the total votes, they were still fairly close to each other, but I guess the voters really took that game seriously. And I guess the narrative coming out of it would be that Duke won despite having, minutes taken away from Paulo Banchero because of what I still hope is just freak cramping stuff. Whereas Duke's playing style was able to frustrate Gonzaga had guys sitting out of the game. Drew Timme and Chet Holmgren both ran into foul trouble in this game that forced them to sit, Holmgren in particular, but that was Duke's playing style that did that, not that it was like a fluke of the game.
So, lightning fast, to be the king, you got to beat the king. That's why Duke's number one and Purdue's not. And then the other thing really quick, because you mentioned the cramping, Paulo tweeted something like in the past 24 hours where he was like, yo, we're dealing with this. Yeah, it ain't going to happen anymore. You're going to see the real, he's like, you're going to see the real Paulo very soon. It's clear to me that something's been going on with him, and they're figuring it out, which is scary, by the way, in a good way.
And on the 1 versus 2 thing, I think the other thing that factors into it is that we beat Kentucky as well. So we have 2 top 10 team or victories, as opposed to Purdue only beating Villanova, but that's a really big win. But they only have 1 top 10 win so far. So right now, again, very, very early in the season, but I think those are the minor differences that people are parsing through to try and figure out who's number 1 and who's number 2.
Yeah, Purdue's other big win is a victory over North Carolina, and that's not a very good win.
No, we don't accept those.
So that's it on the rankings, guys. One final topic. It is as I said at the top, it's a bit of a melancholy one. We're not going to be talking about basketball anymore. We are going to go back and talk about Duke football for a few minutes. We have not really spent much time on the football program in the last few weeks, as the losses have continued to pile up in fairly embarrassing fashion for the Blue Devils. But I would like us to spend a few minutes talking about Coach David Cutcliffe. The athletic department announced yesterday that on Sunday that they and Coach Cutcliffe have agreed on a separation agreement. They didn't call it a firing. They didn't call it a retirement. They called it a separation, which I guess is just mutual. We don't want to fire you. The athletic department, I think, is appropriately grateful for all of David Cutcliffe's accomplishments in Durham, but given the performance of the last few years, sort of feels like it's time to move on. And before I come to each of you for reflections about Coach Cutcliffe and where you kind of think the program is going from here, I just wanted to read from the press release, because I do think it's worth highlighting some of the success here. So Cutcliffe, I'm just reading from the GoDuke.com press release. Cutcliffe was named Duke's head coach on December 15th, 2007. My editorial here, or not editorial, but just to add, this is before Kevin White was the athletic director. This was Joe Oliva's last hire before he left Duke for LSU. So December 2007, took over a Blue Devil program that had won just 8 games the previous 5 years. The 2-time ACC Coach of the Year and 2013 National Coach of the Year, Cutcliffe led Duke to 77 victories in 14 seasons, with 6 bowl game appearances, 3 bowl victories, and the 2013 ACC Coastal Division Championship. The Cutcliffe era included the program's first bowl victory since 1961, a pair of NFL first-round draft picks in Laken Tomlinson and Daniel Jones, an 8-game winning streak in 2013, which was Duke's longest since 1941, and a final national ranking in 2013, 22nd and 23rd, respectively, by the 2 polls, to mark Duke's first showing in a final poll since 1962. So lots of first time for Duke since before anybody who runs this podcast was born stats there to sum up the Cutcliffe era.
I love it when we have stuff that's older than me.
Yeah, that's and unfortunately in Duke football terms, it's not uncommon, especially in the Cutcliffe era. So Donald, I'm going to let you take this one first. Tell me about your thoughts on David Cutcliffe's time in Durham. It was, I think, a lot longer than folks may have anticipated when he was first hired in late 2007.
Yeah, but he earned it. And I mean, let's put it this way. Duke football will forever be changed and has forever been changed by him deciding back in 2007 to come to Duke. And, you know, it's been changed for the better. We've improved facilities. Have an improved stadium. And when you think about it, I think the lasting legacy that he has is not just in the culture that he's created here, but if you watch NFL games on Sundays and you watch Sunday Night Football, you watch Monday Night Football, and you see guys introduce themselves, you see a couple of guys that say that they played at Duke. And I think that is something that we never heard before Cutcliffe arrived. Now we have several players who are not only in the NFL, like you mentioned Laken Tomlinson, and you mentioned Matt Jones being draft picks, first round draft picks. We haven't had
Jones or Daniel Jones.
Daniel Jones. Matt Jones. Matt Jones should have been a first round draft pick. But I mean, like those guys getting reps, being on national television, again, being able to announce their name and say that they played for Duke, they played for Coach Cutcliffe. The amount of guys that have come through that have played for Coach Cutcliffe has elevated this culture to the point where good recruits consider coming here and they consider playing at Duke. And I think that is incredible. So I thank Coach Cut for that. I think the last couple of years, obviously, were very frustrating for everybody. And I'm sure he's the first one to admit that. But I think his lasting legacy is that he has built something that we can take to another level. And I think he had to build a foundation. He didn't have to rebuild it. He had to build it from scratch. And having served on the football team as a video assistant back when we didn't win any games for 2 years. And no, Sam, you also were a manager on the football team. This is what we like to see. And the fact that we have so many players who did not play for Coach Cutcliffe coming out afterwards to say how much he meant to this program, I think speaks a lot for everyone.
What David Cutcliffe did that is so important is that he showed two things. One, that Duke can be committed to playing winning football, that Duke's willing to have salaries and facilities and all the other accoutrements that go with building a winning program. And more importantly, two, he showed that Duke can be successful at football, because make no mistake, there were serious questions about the viability of the Duke football program when David Cutcliffe took this job. So we will be forever in his debt for taking a thankless job that most other folks probably did not want and really turning it into a program that we could be proud of, that fans and alumni would follow, and that would have national respect and would produce guys who play on Sunday. And the past couple of years have been poor, and this season, especially in the ACC, was just dreadful. I mean, we didn't talk about football because Duke was getting the brakes beat off of them every single week, and it was time for a change. But we are also eternally thankful to David Cutcliffe for elevating the program to the point where I think Duke can now look at some really serious, really good, interesting candidates for this job. I'm not going to get into it now. I have no idea. I think it's all speculation. Everyone's guessing at different names and stuff like that. But there's some interesting candidates. There are people that are going to consider this job seriously, who before David Cutcliffe would have laughed if Duke had called. So we are thankful to him for that.
Yeah, as Donald said, and I know that I've talked about numerous times on the show, if you've been listening over the years, I got to work for the football program for 3 semesters. My last 3 semesters in college, I was an equipment manager. And I tweeted a little bit about this yesterday when the news came out. But I even when I worked there, this is not like, oh, I'm just reflecting on this now because he just left the program. But even when I worked there, I had this sense that Coach Cutcliffe was just sort of he was a different kind of guy. He was able to motivate people and encourage people and get the most out of people in ways that I don't think most football coaches have the ability to do. Most teachers don't have the ability to do, which is really what a coach is in a lot of cases. And you can see that in the results on the field. Duke averaged over 5 wins a game in the years that Coach Cutcliffe was in Durham, including the last few years, which were really tough, and including those first few years where he was still, mostly deploying Ted Roof's players and trying to pick up the pieces from what Donald was saying was just a broken program. So I don't think we can honestly state about how much Coach Cutcliffe was able to build in that first 5-6 years that he was at Duke, and then sustain it for a little bit. Just because things have been bad the last couple of years does not mean that we should diminish those accomplishments that he had. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Duke was basically for a 6-7 year stretch there perennially a bowl bound team, which is not something that anyone expected when they hired Coach Cutcliffe. The circumstances around his hiring were sort of interesting. Duke had been through a couple different candidates. They weren't really sure, who they could get. A couple of guys had turned the job down, and Coach Cutcliffe at the time was, I think, looking for a slightly less stressful way for him to continue being a football coach. He had had some health problems, which had prevented him from taking jobs in the past. And it sort of became this, I don't know how much folks remember this. It was sort of a mutual fit that Coach Cutcliffe had all this SEC experience. He was certainly a good enough football coach for Duke to be bringing in. He had been the head coach at Ole Miss. He had been an offensive coordinator at Tennessee for a long time. Like, no one would question that he was capable of that, but that he hadn't coached in the ACC. He hadn't coached at, let's face it, a school like Duke before. And I remember him being surprised that first year about how all the players were bringing their homework on the bus on the way to road games. He was like, I'm not really familiar with this dynamic, but it's cool. So power to them. And then when I was working there were just so many times when I could see Coach Cutcliffe motivating people in ways that I think are uncommon. So I'm really proud to have worked for him for the program, not obviously directly, but proud to have worked there, and I'm proud of all that he accomplished. So really, from the bottom of my heart, as a former employee here, as well as a fan of the program, thank you, Coach Cutcliffe, for all that you did for Duke football. I think that the coaching search this time around is going to look entirely different than it did in 2007 for reasons that are mostly due to the job well done that he did over the last 14 years in Durham. And before we get to that, or before we wrap, I guess, Donald, I think we have a little bit of speculation about where Duke might be going with this selection. If you remember, we talked to Nina King and Kevin White a bit about Coach Cutcliffe and looming retirements and things a few months ago. But just to update everybody, Nina King, who recently promoted new athletic director at Duke, ran the search last year to hire Kara Lawson as the women's basketball coach, oversaw the transition that's going on now from Mike Krzyzewski to John Shire in the men's basketball side, and now has to replace a football coach. So she has been very busy building the stable of Duke coaches, key Duke coaches on campus. So Donald, what are we thinking here about the football coaching search that Duke is about to undergo?
And we knew Nina was going to have to take some of these responsibilities. We knew there were some longtime coaches that were going to be at or near the conclusion of their tenure here at Duke. And the fact that she's had to step in and kind of do essentially the top three in the span of a year is incredible. We have no doubt that she's going to hire somebody great. But I did want to, just kind of for a minute here, we don't like to speculate a lot. We're going to have some candidate names that have been thrown out there as potentials. Some of the ones that I thought were interesting. We'll start with Alabama offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien, who, as everyone knows, coached as offensive coordinator at Duke back in 2005, 2006, was in the NFL. He's coached Penn State. He's coached just about everywhere. But that would be an interesting one just because of his ties to Duke, and also because it's probably the biggest splash name out there that does have a tie to Duke. So Bill O'Brien out there. A lot of people have kind of hinted at Gary Patterson, the former TCU head coach, who obviously has had a lot of experience in a Power 5 conference at a private school. So that connection is there. Navy head coach Ken Numatolo, who has been at Navy forever, since he was at BYU, then he went to Navy, has been there just about forever. The one I think a lot of people are kind of excited about on the offensive coordinator standpoint is the Michigan offensive coordinator, Josh Gaddis, who obviously Michigan is having a terrific season. They are on the verge of the Big Ten championship. But that would be an interesting one. And then for me, I think a couple of local coaches that people have been throwing out: East Carolina head coach Mike Houston, Coastal Carolina head coach Jamie Chadwell, And Charlotte head coach Will Healy, of course, Duke fans know him very well, as Charlotte beat Duke early to start the season. So those are some of the guys. Obviously, the list is long, longer than that. There's some offensive coordinators and head coaches that are there. But I thought those were some of the ones that were most intriguing.
So Gaddis is really interesting, and a lot of folks in the DBR forums are excited about him because he has a connection to Durham in North Carolina. I believe he went to Wake Forest. And there are people who say he's the kind of person who, if he got the job and did well, might not immediately be looking to go someplace else with it because of his connection to the area. And I have to mention, because I have a good friend, I'm not going to say his name because he hasn't authorized me to do that, but I have a good friend. He's posted on the DBR boards about this, who is somewhat connected to Greg Romans, the offensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens, who is someone who is really well regarded. And this friend of mine says that he knows that Greg Romans is interested in this job. So we shall see. We shall see. That would be another hire that I think would get a lot of attention because he's obviously done really well in the NFL.
And I think that, going back to the conversation about Coach Cutcliffe, Duke, I think, understands a lot better what kind of program it is today than it did 14 years ago. I mean, they made the facility upgrades that sort of cemented Duke as, look, we're not competing for national championships in football. There are not many programs that get to compete for national championships in football. Duke does not have the recipe for that. What Duke can offer is an experience for student athletes and for coaches that is fairly unique in the ACC in terms of, you've got nice facilities, but you've got the academics, you've got the support of a university that is not going to hang you in effigy just because you lost a bad non-conference game. And there is a place for a lot of coaches there, whether this is a destination for them or whether this is just a stop along the way in their career.
And honestly, what we've shown in the Cutcliffe era is, one, we can compete for Coastal Division championships. We won one in 2013. Every team in the Coastal has won a division in the last 9 years. So that is possible, but also doing that while graduating almost everybody. I mean, we have been at or near the top of the APR in football for the better part of a decade. So we can win here. We can compete for championships. May not be national championships, but like you said, there's only a select few that are doing that. But we can compete for coastal championships. We can compete at that point for ACC titles. And then we're also doing that while graduating players. So I think this is a very unique situation. And again, Coach Cut paved the way for all of that.
One more Coach Cut fact related to division titles that I meant to share earlier. If you don't think that what Coach Cutcliffe did in 2013 was amazing, Duke won an ACC Coastal Division title before Miami did. Miami football. Duke achieved something before Miami football did in the same conference. So
same division.
I don't know how to. I don't know how to put the 2013 season into enough perspective, despite being a year when Duke lost its bowl game. Just about the proudest you could possibly be.
I went to that bowl game. That was like the greatest bowl. That was so
I
much
was there
fun.
too.
What a great bowl game. Oh.
We're all three of us were there.
I didn't know that until this moment, but yes.
This is pre DBR podcast, but we were all in the building for the
that was for the Georgia Johnny Manziel game.
It was. Manziel was amazing.
It was like I think, Jason, every Duke fan that I talked to left that game with the same feeling, like, yeah, it's a bummer we lost, but what a great season and what a great game to have been.
Yeah, exactly.
We got there. Yeah.
No one, I don't think anyone regrets that experience. So hats off to Coach Cutcliffe. Hopefully he gets to enjoy some retirement. If he does want to keep coaching, hopefully he finds a gig, but he's 67 years old and has been a head coach for a long time. So I assume he's got plenty of money and doesn't have to work anymore if he doesn't have to. Okay. We will speculate more about football coaches if we hear any more scuttlebutt. Before we leave, I know Jason had one more thing that he wanted to share about the Gonzaga game. So we are going to go back to basketball for 1 second.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. This is such a long podcast. There's no one still listening at this point. Everyone's turned it off. So I'll share that.
Oh, they're still listening. They're still listening. They're in pins and needles waiting for this moment, Jason.
So there was a moment at the end of the Duke Gonzaga game. And I'd meant to mention this the other day when we were recapping the game and I forgot to. It was buried underneath my notes and stuff, but I just wanted to recount sort of a little personal story. With 19 seconds left in the game, Duke was up by 3 points. Gonzaga called timeout. You guys may remember this moment. Both teams talked about their strategy, and then Duke inbounded the ball and immediately got fouled, and they fouled Wendell Moore. And he went to the free throw line. He missed the first and he made the second. Nothing has materially changed in the game at that point. Duke was up 3. Now they're up 4. Yeah, but I mean, he's going to the line for 2 free throws. All this is to be expected. Coach K called timeout. It was Duke's last timeout. And I'll be honest, I started screaming at the TV. I was like, why is K using his last timeout here? I was like, nothing has changed. We know everything we knew earlier. Yeah, he made 1 out of 2 free throws. It wasn't a big deal. I don't understand why he wasted his last timeout. And I said to my brother-in-law, who was watching the game with me, who's a fellow Duke fan, I was like, if Duke gets trapped and doesn't have a timeout, or they can't inbound the ball and don't have a timeout, or if, God forbid, someone calls a timeout we don't have and we get called for a technical, I was like, I'm going to lose my mind. I'm going to drive to damn Vegas and I'm going to just, destroy Coach K. I couldn't believe that he wasted his last time out there. I was like, this is just terrible coaching. I was so mad. And what happens? Gonzaga comes out of that timeout. Gonzaga inbounds the ball. Duke is in a completely different defense than we've been the whole game. We're in a 3/4 court trap designed to slow them down. As the ball crosses half court, we're trapping and preventing them from getting into their offense and getting off a good 3-pointer. Gonzaga ends up, there was about 15, 16 seconds left on the clock. Gonzaga ends up not taking a shot until like 3 seconds are left in the game. And Chet Holmgren ends up getting the rebound. They miss it. Chet Holmgren gets the rebound and dunks it. It's meaningless. Game is over. And I turned to my brother-in-law and I was like, okay, there's a reason this Coach K guy is the greatest of all time. I'm an idiot. I thought he called the timeout to completely change what Duke was doing on defense. Go back and watch those final 20 seconds. It is coaching genius. He knew Mark Few had to have a 3-pointer, rather than taking a 2. And so he called timeout to set up a defense that would make it impossible for Gonzaga to get a good 3. Okay, I'm done with that now.
That was exactly what I said to my dad in the stands when he came out in that set. I go, they're going to pass the ball around and they're not going to get a shot off. And sure enough, I just said, hey, they can pass all day. They can pass all day. The problem is they don't have all day. They have 5 seconds. And as soon as I said that, my dad goes, ball game's over. Like, I see how they're doing. Ball game's over. But again, a genius move by the GOAT.
All right. Love it. We will be back after the Ohio State game on Tuesday. Tune in for all of the ACC Big Ten Challenge and just hope the ACC is able to perform better than the projections would tell you they will. So stay in touch with us, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. We got a lot more great emails this weekend. I'd love to read more of them on the show, but we've already been here for like an hour. So we have to cut it off. Stay in touch with us, dbrpodcast@gmail.com. Rate, review anywhere that you listen to podcasts. For Jason Evans, for Donald Wine, I'm Sam Klein. This has been episode 363 of the Duke Basketball Report podcast. Duke Band, take us home.